This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Okay, thanks everybody to being here. We are going to start this afternoon session. We are going to start with the keynote from Daniele Procida. He's the community manager from Divio. He has been organizing many DjangoCon conferences. He's a member of the board of the Django Software Foundation. And he's going to delight us with a talk that's titled When We Were Young and in Love. Thank you. Big hand for it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the PyCon Germany organizers for inviting me. My name is Daniele Procida. I'm the community manager at Divio, a Swiss software company. I'm a Django CMS developer. I know many people here will be Django CMS users. I'm also a core developer of the Django project and a member of the Django Software Foundation board. All these things are very important to me. Django CMS, through Django CMS or alongside Django CMS, I came to Django and to Python and to programming in the first place, really. So it's been an important relationship. I should also point out that, quite uniquely, I am actually Python software, as you can see on that slide up there. So perhaps there's some deployment issues. So the title of this talk is When We Were Young and in Love. And it's about some of the issues that I know many of you will be confronting because you are involved in open source software projects. Now, in the beginning, everything is new and exciting. Beginnings are promises. In the beginning, you know that something's happening, but you aren't quite sure what you've discovered or where you're going to go. So promises are the most exciting thing. And here's a beginning. And of course, it's quite a lot of fun and very exciting to find yourself, for example, swinging in a hammock with a young woman at a summer party. But there's something more, because excitement about a promise is a deeper kind of excitement than excitement simply about something that's happening right now. And I keep reading that it's wiser or more spiritually advanced to live in the moment. But to me, that doesn't seem right. Maybe I should be more Zen or be a bit more Buddhist or something. To me, it seems that what's special about a promise and the excitement that goes with a promise is that it extends somehow into the future, even into the far future. So what gives a beginning or a promise its meaning is its possibility of its fulfillment. It's why a beginning is bigger than itself. And here's another beginning, another promise. I first saw this towards the end of 2008. We needed a CMS, and I'd just heard about Django for the first time. So here was what I was waiting for. And I remember checking daily for that information that was promised, like checking the letterbox every day to see if a letter had arrived from someone. And then one day the information arrived, and there was a new project. And there was a community that I could join. And I remember joining the email list and seeing the first messages on it. I remember the excitement of talking daily on IRC with people who turned out to have other names like Patrick and Stefan and Jonas and Angelo and Benny and Chris. And I was so surprised to find out that those weren't their real names. And bit by bit, I became more involved in this new Django CMS project. Back in those days, I worked in the School of Medicine at Cardiff University. And we were all completely new to Python and Django, and in my case, really new to programming as well. And often I'd be looking at a problem or an idea for the CMS with my colleague Ben. And after a while, we'd say, let's ask Patrick. And we'd jump into the IRC channel and say, hello, Patrick, I've got an idea. And quite often, Patrick would say, no. But sometimes he would say, that's not a bad idea. And sometimes he'd say, I need to think about this properly. I'll go outside to have a cigarette. And this represented the height of excitement for me, that I had had an idea or come up with a problem that was good enough to make a professional software developer in another country whom I'd never met before have to go outside and smoke a cigarette just to think about the thing that I'd suggested, just to think about the idea that I'd had. And sometimes it would be, I'm going to need 2 cigarettes for this one. So you probably can't imagine how excited this made us feel in Cardiff, in our little office at the university. Oh, Ben, guess what Patrick says? He needs 2 cigarettes to think about this one. It was like God saying to Adam, good question. And we knew we were really onto something when that happened. We didn't smoke, but from then onwards, really good problems or really good questions became 2 cigarette problems. And I loved many things about what I discovered back in 2008, and they were all related to having discovered an open source project. The idealism of free software, being free, being able to contribute, being able to make a difference, being valued, being an inventor, being a volunteer. And there's something very special about being a volunteer. People love volunteering, and of course it's sometimes simply because they're volunteering to do something they love. But yet, the volunteering part of it makes it even more special. And this was extremely exciting for me. It was the start of my career as a programmer. And I know perfectly well that some people might have different ideas or standards of exciting. So if you jump off mountains, or you drive sports cars, or you swim with sharks, or fight with bears, or do judo with Vladimir Putin, then probably you will pity my feeble standards of excitement. But all I can say is that this was genuinely one of the most thrilling times of my life. And it was exciting, but not in the way that jumping off a mountain might be exciting. It was exciting because I could taste a promise. And it was exciting because I knew something important was beginning, and I didn't know where it was going to take me. So that was then. That was 8 years ago. 8 years is a long time in software, and 22 years is a long time for anybody. But what about now? Well, here's Django CMS now. It's a pretty big development project. We have nearly 4,500 stars on GitHub, nearly 1,700 forks on GitHub, about 1 million PyPI downloads. We're guessing because it's, as you may know, it's quite hard to get that information accurately out of PyPI, but that's what we think. We've had over 300 contributors, and we have several dedicated paid developers. Django CMS is used by universities, media organizations, banks, scientific research laboratories, arts organizations, museums, and corporations all around the world. We've had a book written about us. We've even had our first conference. Django CMS is a success story. It continues to be a success. It fulfilled that promise that it made 8 years ago. And it's been a great journey for Django CMS, and a personal journey for me too, because it's through this project that I got to where I am now. So it means really a great deal to me. In fact, I work now at Devio, the company behind Django CMS, and being invited to do that was like Adam being invited to play on God's team. So it's been quite a journey. From its promising beginning, Django CMS has become mature, respectable, and polished. And perhaps you too have been involved with a project that has made a similar journey from a promising beginning and initial excitement to maturity. In other words, perhaps you've been involved with a project that has grown up with relationships that have matured and developed. But don't think that it's safe to relax at this point because there's something lying in wait. There's a midlife crisis hiding around every corner in maturity. It's not only beginnings that are delicate times. Beginnings are marked by excitement, but the excitement of the new doesn't last forever. And it can't last forever because things stop being new. They don't stay new forever. If you expect them to stay new forever, or if you feel too nostalgic for the excitement of the new, you fall into the same trap as, for example, a middle-aged man who starts to feel disappointed in his partner of 30 years because she no longer makes him feel the same way he felt when they first met. It's an unreasonable expectation. And the next thing you know, someone's having feelings they don't really understand about someone half their age. Or they're trying to go back into the past and reawaken a relationship that they had from half a lifetime ago. And they're generally having a good old midlife crisis. And this is the basis for some very enjoyable Bill Murray films, but in real life it's much less fun to watch. And you know it will end badly for everybody, all because someone had the wrong expectations about excitement and about how things should feel. So that's one trap. Another trap is neglect, an equally destructive one, to neglect important feelings and forget that they matter or how they matter. And if we forget to look after a relationship, it will just get older, whereas it must grow and develop. It must continue to find new exciting things or new ways to find the excitement. Now, most people have a reasonable understanding of these things when it comes to personal relationships, even if it's not always so easy to avoid these traps. But my question is, how can this help us think about software? Well, it's actually remarkably easy to fall out of love, nearly as easy as falling in love with a person or with your work, with a community, or with a project that you're involved in. Any such relationship can fall victim to unreasonable expectations or neglect. So let's be mature about these relationships. 8 years later, I'm still very much involved with Django CMS, but we're not developing Django CMS in the way that we used to. We're a large team now. We can't do things the old day. It's not like when someone would appear on IRC with a tasty problem or a bright idea, and then one person would go outside with a cigarette for 10 minutes and come back with a solution or an idea for an implementation. Our ways of working and our relationships with our community have had to mature and change. The beginning was exciting, but you can imagine the chaos if we tried to keep that excitement going or work in the same way. But it's still natural to miss the excitement sometimes. And I don't think it hurts to remember it or think about it. And I think it's something we should think about. And I know that other people in our Django CMS community also miss something about those days. They complain about it sometimes, that things aren't like the way they used to be. Now they feel that the core team of Django CMS is no longer as responsive or ready to answer members of the community as they were. Now they complain sometimes that Django CMS is too much focused on business interests of its financial backers and rather than the ideas and needs of the community. And what do these complaints mean? Does it mean that we have selfish, ungrateful users who don't realize how hard we work? Or does it mean that we are not looking after our community? Or is it simply a sign that as we are maturing, that these relationships are simply changing? So now we're talking really about relationships. What kind of relationships can we have? Do we want? Should we seek? What kind of relationships can we offer? What kind of relationships can the community expect? And it's not just a question for Django CMS. Many people in communities in the open source world are asking the same questions. We have some of the same questions in the wider Django and Python communities too. And they're genuine questions without obvious answers. The only thing that's obvious to me is that we have to keep thinking and talking about these things now so that we're not taken by surprise later if the relationship unfolds in a way that we weren't expecting or a way we don't like. That's the mature thing to do. when it comes to people and their relationships, it's the difference between growing up and simply growing older. To grow up means to change and develop in an appropriate way, maybe even to become better. Well, what happens to software projects as they get older? They can mature, like Django CMS or Django. They can become more stable, benefit from more consistent policies, contributions, funding, release cycles. They can become more sustainable. They can be planned better. The alternative is simply unhappiness, recrimination, and failure. Because the alternative to growing up isn't to stay young forever. The alternative to growing up is to die. And you can't sustain a relationship or a project on the basis of enthusiasm or excitement alone. And you can't afford to neglect a relationship, even when it's mature. You can't afford not to talk about it. And you can't afford for it not to become a little bit boring. If you do, whether it's a personal relationship or an endeavor in software, it will soon enough fall apart and everyone will suffer. So to keep it healthy, to keep a relationship alive and healthy in the long term, we have to keep talking about it or start talking about it if we haven't started already. That's simply part of being mature. And you may have noticed one thing in particular that mature people like to talk about. It's money. Let's talk about money openly and without embarrassment, which is something that we're not very good at doing in the world of open source software. What has helped Django CMS be an open source software success story? Well, I mentioned earlier that one sign of its success was the fact that it has several dedicated paid developers, employees of Divio and other organizations working on it. They are people who get paid to develop it, not just to write code, but to write tests and documentation, and review submissions, to examine bug reports, to meet, to discuss it, to support it, to understand users' needs. I'm one of these people. And there are people whose paid employment it is to make the software better. And their paid labors are one of the reasons why Django CMS is considered a tool of choice by the organizations that have adopted it, in some cases entrusting critical aspects of their business to it. It's successful because money has gone into it. Another example is Django itself. The Django Software Foundation began raising money specifically for the purpose of employing or paying a Django fellow, a contractor, to help undertake some of the administrative and community management tasks of the Django project and support rapid development of Django itself. It's been very successful. Each week, Tim Graham, who's the tireless Django fellow, triages numerous new tickets, merges several non-trivial patches. The last 3 releases of Django have been released on schedule, which never happened before, thanks to Tim's paid labors. The funds brought a lot of stability and progress at the same time to the Django project, and it's really hard to imagine going back to another way of doing things. What's more, that stability and progress have brought more money in. Maybe in recent months you've heard about the substantial money that Mozilla has invested in Django and in projects like Django channels and in the Django REST framework. It's the result of Tim's remunerated labors that have made it possible for organizations like that to invest into the project. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, what about the volunteers in this talk? Well, you're right to ask about that, because I'm not in any way decrying the spirit of volunteerism. Volunteers are the lifeblood of open source projects. And Django CMS and Django are successful thanks to money, but not only thanks to money. They've also relied upon an army of volunteers. Volunteer programmers have created the software that we use and love. And it wouldn't exist without this army of programmers who have freely given many thousands and thousands of hours of their time. Our communities, I'm not just talking about Django, I'm talking about everywhere in open source. Our communities, organizations, and initiatives benefit from freely offered labor. The PSF, the DSF, the Django Girls organization, other initiatives and efforts that make everyone's work and lives in the communities better. Our conferences that we love so much, like this one, they are thanks to volunteers. So, the next thing you do after leaving this talk, please go and say thank you to a volunteer, because this happens through their generosity of spirit. Really, thank you to the volunteers for putting this on. Volunteers really are special, and money may make all of those things possible or successful, but it's the spirit of the volunteers that makes open source software special and meaningful in a way that money doesn't. We love our software projects and our communities and our collaborators because of that spirit. I love volunteering. I love being part of volunteer projects, and the fact that I'm doing it freely alongside lots of other people who are also doing it freely makes it special to me. And when we volunteer, we tend not to count our time the way we do in our employed work. We're not being paid for it, but somehow that makes us happy to give more of it, to give more of ourselves than we would otherwise. And sometimes it leads us to give more than we really have to give. So what are we doing to our volunteers in that case? And what are we doing to ourselves, because we are volunteers? Now, Halloween isn't until Monday, I think, but I want to tell you a horror story. And if you're of a sensitive disposition, you might want to look away for the next couple of minutes. So some of you probably know this story already. It was New Year's Eve on the 31st of December 2011. And all across Europe, people were happily celebrating and getting ready to welcome the new year. Here in Germany, it was 3 seconds to midnight. Robin Segelman, one of the contributors to the OpenSSL project, had been working that month on a pull request. Stephen Henson, a member of the core team, committed it. It contained the heartbleed bug. This horror bug, which was described as being so bad that it makes shutting down the internet for a while seem like a good idea, compromised a library that is used by millions upon millions of systems across the world. The bug compromised a vast number of products and services. It affected Debian, Ubuntu, OpenBSD, FreeBSD. It affected Android, Google Search, Gmail, YouTube Wallet, Play, apps, and the App Engine. It affected Amazon, Facebook, Tumblr, Yahoo, Cisco, and others. And it wasn't discovered until more than 2 years later, in April 2014. And it cost the global economy a sum estimated by some in billions of dollars in order to fix. So we can summarize by saying that actually it made many people unhappy. There was a huge amount of criticism, complaint, and abuse directed at OpenSSL and its developers and at open source software in general. A lot of it came from within the world of open source software, and it was very harsh. OpenSSL is not developed by a responsible team, so that must hurt coming from something like the leader of the OpenBSD project. Of course, the anti-open source software crowd, you can imagine how they were crowing. And why was the open source world so shocked? Well, this wasn't meant to happen. Given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. This is the fabulous Eric S. Raymond. Meaning, if you have enough people looking at a problem, then it won't be such a big problem after all. So let's put this into context. Hundreds of thousands of companies and billions of people were dependent in one way or another for OpenSSL for their internet security. By any standards, OpenSSL was a very big deal. When something went wrong with it, it had an economic effect that went into the billions of dollars. So what about the team behind this big deal project? What about the eyeballs? Not enough eyeballs? There are no eyeballs here. 2 guys named Steve, and I hear they also have a very nice dog. The dog wasn't doing code review. That's Jim Zemlin. he was exaggerating a bit because, in fact, there were actually 4 of them and they weren't all called Steve. But still, the OpenSSL Foundation was raising less than $2,000 a year, I understand. This tiny band of people responsible for maintaining, in effect, a cornerstone of internet security were pretty much expected to do it for free. And this is just one example of failure of this kind in an open source project. And it happens over and over again. And usually we get away with it, but sometimes we don't. This is what people imagine, that they will learn to code, they'll create a useful open source package, and then they'll enjoy collaboration, support, and gratitude. But the reality is that they'll create a vital cornerstone of the internet, they'll maintain it as a free open source software in their free time, and then they'll collect abuse as a reward. So something's wrong here. Well, what exactly is wrong? You can turn back now if you were turning away. I'll tell you a boring story to make up for that one. So earlier this year, Django CMS, we received a report of a security vulnerability in our software. Now, Django CMS is a successful product, but it's not a cornerstone of security for 1 billion people. It powers tens of thousands of websites, not billions of systems. But when we received the report, we were able to have several people working on it almost immediately. We spent several hours on it. It wasn't in our free time. We were paid to do it. It wasn't a crisis that distracted us from our jobs. It was our job. So what a luxury. What a world where being paid to work can appear to be a luxury. Now, some people do think still that if Django CMS, or Django itself for that matter, were developed only by volunteers working in their free time, it would somehow be better or purer. But for whom is it better if a programmer improves software in their free time, or at a time when they should be eating their dinner with their families or putting their children to bed or trying to earn a living? And this is fundamentally a problem of attitude that applies to open source software generally. Somehow, the idea that software can be free has been understood to mean that its programmers can afford to work for nothing. Somehow, the idea that it's great to be a volunteer, which it is, has become the idea that programmers can be expected to be nothing but volunteers, or that somehow it's better that they are volunteers. And it's an idea that has become normal, even though we know perfectly well that programmers need money in order to survive in this world, just like everyone else. Now, if you spell out something like that, you'll find that people don't actually believe it. Because when you spell out an idea, then it's easy to catch it and point out what's wrong with it and challenge it. But when it's allowed to exist as an attitude, then it doesn't get challenged. People hold things as an attitude, and they live by that attitude, and they don't even realize what they're doing. Even free open source software volunteers adopt these attitudes themselves. The users of an open source package don't feel indebted to the author. It's the author who feels indebted to its users. The author feels under obligations to the users. The user reports a bug, and the author feels obliged to fix it, as if they have somehow let the user down, even when they were working in their free time, unpaid. And it's extraordinary how ready we are as open source software volunteers to internalize these ideas, and how hard it is to escape their influence. And the consequences are very readily apparent. We have these occasional crises like Heartbleed, global risk, not always global risk, but projects do falter, valuable projects of other kinds. We have exhausted, unrewarded, and disillusioned developers. We have burned out volunteers. We have people falling out of love with open source software. So let's go back to the beginning. Again, let's go back to that feeling of being young and in love. Remember, these things, they all still matter to me. They're all still important. I still love them. But I can only enjoy them in the long term because they're not the only things that sustain my participation. I can enjoy them because I have a job. And other people in the Django CMS community get to enjoy them because Django CMS has commercial value that helps sustain a company, that employs people like me, that helps sustain the project. I can afford to get excited about these things because each month, by magic, my salary arrives in my bank account. What I cannot realistically do is expect all or most of my involvement in the project to be based on these things. We can't expect now to have the experience that we had back in the beginning. And I admit I really would love it sometimes if when I had a good idea, my colleagues went outside for 10 minutes with a cigarette and then came back with a way to implement my brilliant idea. But instead, we have to have meetings and estimations and go through project managers and all these really boring things that turn out, very sadly, to have higher priority than my brilliant ideas. But it's an unreasonable expectation to want that, to insist on that being the case. It's incompatible with the development of our software, and it's also incompatible with the maturity of the project that makes that possible in the long term. And similarly, we can still enjoy some of the things that were special about the early days. They're still important, they're still exciting, but I can only enjoy them in the long run because they're not the only things that sustain my participation in that relationship. We can enjoy them because of all the boring, unexciting things that make them possible. We can enjoy them because of all the unexciting value that has been invested in the relationship. We can enjoy them, we can afford to be excited about them because they're being paid for through the daily work of maintaining a family, a household, a relationship, because of all the boring talk about things like money. And what we can't realistically do is expect all, or even most of our time to be like that. We can't expect the experience now to be like the experience we had then. And I'd love it sometimes if it could be like it was 22 years ago. But there are these other obligations and commitments and things that have to be dealt with. And it's disappointing, but it's just an unreasonable expectation to think that it could be like that all over again, all the time. In fact, it's an expectation that, once again, is incompatible with being able to enjoy those things in the long term, even if it means enjoying them less often. So I cannot give anybody practical advice about relationships or about software, and frankly, if you come to me for advice about either, you're going to have more problems than the ones you came to me with, or bigger ones. But I think the key, not just to success even, but simply to survival, is to have reasonable expectations and ideas, and not false ones. It really was wonderful to be young and in love. And it really is wonderful to discover some new open source community or project to become involved in. But what makes those discoveries really great is the promise they hold for the future. Because in the future, you won't be young anymore, hard as it might be to imagine. And in the future, your open source project won't be new anymore. But the future is the only place where you can fulfill the promise of being young. And if you want to attain that fulfillment, then we have to grow up as well as simply growing older. Because right now, we're in a world where very often open source software projects and people's attitudes to them and people's relationships within them are growing older, but they're not growing up. So they're growing older and tireder and they're facing these crises of neglect or midlife crisis. And those attitudes and their consequences represent a real danger to us, to our relationships in software and elsewhere, and to our projects and our endeavors. Thank you.
Given that some features realistically, be it in Django CMS or Django itself, will only happen if they are paid by some company, how do you explain volunteers that their work is still wanted and needed, and that they shouldn't get devalued or feel devalued by not earning something? Because they are doing the same or more important work, even just they don't have a company behind to bake it.
Yeah. It's really tricky. Imagine being a volunteer contributor to the Django project, and you hear that Mozilla's passing, $150,000 in our direction. You think, well, I'm doing this for nothing in my free time. Why should I continue giving my free time when other people are getting paid for it? And quite possibly some people will choose to go somewhere else. They might think I'm not needed so much anymore. What's happened in the case of Django is actually, I think, the opposite. That the money that has helped Tim Graham do his work means the experience of contributors to the project is actually much better. They ask a question, they get an answer quicker. They file a ticket, they get a response more quickly. They get more feedback on their pull requests. Tim is a machine, plowing through these pull requests and sending them back and giving hints and feedback. So actually, it is benefiting contributors. More difficult is the question of users who don't see their own ideas or needs being fulfilled in the project, but see the needs of maybe large corporations or bigger or software companies or financial backers entering the software. I don't know what the answer is. It's an economic reality in this world that who's got the money is the one who calls the tune. And we have to realize this. We're not living in a different fairyland where the normal rules of economics do not apply in open source software. They apply there also. And we have to understand that. And not understanding it is a path to these recriminations.
Any other question?
There's one up there.
Hearing about that, actually including money in the equation makes a lot of sense. But then there's got to be a business model, which means there's got to be added value, and then there's got to be money, obviously. And we should, as developers, obviously, if you want to get involved in some kind of open source project, we gotta understand someone is paying for a larger picture than the one we are seeing. My question is, should we then, I mean, is a death sentence then for an open source project, the fact that they do try to avoid external financiation?
I don't necessarily think it's a death sentence. I think there are lots of different models. I don't know if any of you heard Lasse's talk just before lunch, but it was very interesting to hear about a new open source, or young open source project, the Koala project, and how it's starting these conversations right from the beginning, which is a really good sign. The thing of OpenSSL, for example, that's a kind of extreme example where these guys were getting nothing, and yet the consequences ran into billions of dollars. So I think there are a lot of things in between. I certainly don't think you need to have money in open source software, but you do need to have the mature attitudes that allow you at least to talk about the question of money in a sensible, grown-up way.
Anyone else?
Thanks for the talk. Thank you for pointing out that sometimes the mentality gets so ingrained that we don't even notice how we are indebted to volunteers. I would like to point out a counterpoint. I've read about a study that indicated that sometimes work gets less interesting once you get paid to do the same thing. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that volunteering really is a special thing, but it's easy to volunteer when you're getting a salary. It's not so easy to volunteer when you don't have anything to live on, or when the volunteering is taking up all your time. There's one there.
Do you feel you have more freedom when you volunteer? So, if you don't want to work today on something, or you don't want to work on this bug, you don't have to do it. You can push it to someone else. Where you're paid, you kind of are committed that you have to do these things.
Well, you'd think so, yeah? But who maintains an open source package here in their spare time? Yeah? And who has found themselves going to bed late, or missing a meal, or ignoring your boyfriend or your girlfriend or something because you were busy working on that project? So yes, you should be free, but we've internalized this thing. So a bug comes in, you think, oh shit, what have I done? I've committed a crime, I've done something wrong, I've let down my users. It's a kind of madness. I've got one kind of suggestion. I didn't really want to put it on a slide. If we want people to understand what the value of this volunteer unpaid labor is, well, how many of you have ever been on strike? Yeah? No, not that many of you. What if we went on strike for one day in the year and refused to do any volunteer unpaid labor on open source projects? So if you're getting paid to do it, fine, go ahead. But withdraw your labor for 24 hours. If everybody around the world who works for nothing on open source projects did that, then I think that would be an interesting experiment, an interesting social exercise to see what the response would be, and to find out if somebody could calculate the value of all this unpaid labor that the world is depending on without even realizing it. Because you don't want to necessarily, it's not a question of people being selfish or greedy or corporations not living up to their responsibilities. It's not obvious to them. It's not easy actually to get money into open source software. And that's one of the things that we have to start talking about in order to improve this world that we've been working in for the last 20 years or so. I think we're probably out of time, aren't we?
You have 2 minutes.
I've got 2 minutes. I just wanted to say that if you want to talk to me about Devi or Django CMS or about Django, please come and catch me anytime during the conference. But if maybe we've got time for one more question.
Any other question? I don't have to ask. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And please don't forget to go and say thank you to the conference volunteers for their efforts in this event.